In this session, we're going to talk about general job site safety. Some of you folks have taken OSHA. You have your OSHA 10 card, you got your OSHA 30 card, and that's great. And a lot of that stuff is going to apply in this situation, but we're going to be adding to that. We're going to be talking about specific hazards that you're going to run into while you're doing building analysis and how to stay safe. We're also going to talk about home and health safety for the building occupant. So we're going to talk about both. We're talking about how to keep yourself safe, and we're going to talk about how to keep the homeowner safe, either from the appliances, combustion appliances that they're dealing with, or actually from you, the tests that you're going to do to keep them from doing more harm than good. The organization that regulates safety in this particular industry is OSHA. They're overseeing any kind of job-related hazards that you may run into. The general construction 1926 standard applies to you, as well as the general industry standard, which is 1910. They also identify personal protective equipment that you may need, depending on if you're working on a new construction or something like that. Your fall protection, all your environmental controls, everything else like that. The OSHA, make sure that you're familiar with the OSHA standards that are relevant to your job before you go out onto a job site. When you enter into somebody else's home, safety, 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 okay? That's what you want to make sure that you're thinking. We talked about when we're doing our pre-audit, we've rolled up on the home and we're having our safety briefing with ourselves. We're thinking about yesterday, did I do something stupid yesterday and unsafe? If I did, I want to make sure that I don't do that same thing today. At night, we were keeping ourselves abreast of some of the most recent safety issues. We were reading about mold contamination or whatever the newest thing is, right? Are we keeping those kinds of things in mind when we're doing our job? We also want to, the second thing we want to keep in mind is do no harm. We can actually go into a home, and in our process of trying to save the homeowner money and make the homeowner more comfortable, we can actually put the homeowner in danger. We can actually hurt them, do things that will result in their being unhealthy or their home being unhealthy. And we'll talk about that as we move along. That job site safety briefing, what should that include? A checklist of your personal protective equipment. The safety, that should be your theme of the day. Every day should have the same theme, okay? You should be current on all the potential health hazards and the information about it, okay? You should be up to date on what the current lead requirements are. You should be up to date on what the current asbestos requirements are. You should be up to date on what the current mold requirements are, okay? And understand how to at least identify these things in general. And if there's any kind of new practices, okay? Are you using the latest respirator technology, okay? Are your safety glasses ANSI approved? Okay, whatever health and safety requirements are current, those are the safety requirements that you should be following. Here's a list of some examples of personal protective equipment that you would carry as an energy auditor. You want to have a respirator, and it lists here a dust mask. I would favor a respirator. Now, if you're going to use a respirator, make sure it's the appropriate type of respirator. What are you most trying to protect yourself against? Fine particulate dust, mold. The finest of particulate dust that you'll run into is asbestos. Now, you don't work with asbestos regularly, okay? But that's the lowest common denominator. So you want to make sure that your respirator will filter. You're using a HEPA filter that's fine enough that's going to catch asbestos, because you may run into asbestos from time to time. So now, when we grab our respirator is really designed to help us when we run into unexpected hazards. So what we're talking about is we go up into the attic, right? We're going into this unknown situation, and we get up there and we discover vermiculite.
Which is what?
Which is, oftentimes contains asbestos, okay? So we run into this unexpected situation. For example, just going back to the respirator. I have a friend who's an auditor, and he's old school. Safety really doesn't come up that much. And he goes places without a respirator that he shouldn't, okay? But this particular day, he's going down into a crawl space, and he's fully geared up. He's got his glasses on, he's got his Tyvek suit on, he's got his respirator on, and he's down into this crawl space. And he's moving around and inspecting this crawl space, not really expecting to find much of anything. And he crawls down, goes around the corner, and he looks up. And underneath the bathtub, it is just solid black with mold. Okay? Now, the mold actually started on the other side of the decking, on the other side of the plywood, and had made its way all the way through the plywood. Okay, black mold. And he's sitting down there and he's looking at this going, wow, I'm really glad I'm wearing my respirator today. Okay, that's what these things are for. These things are for not going into known dangerous situations, because that's not your job. It's for, I just ran into something that I wasn't expecting to run into, and now I'm protected. Okay, so you're wearing a respirator, you're wearing glasses, you've got your gloves on, you've got your Tyvek suit on, and you run into something that you weren't expecting to run into, and now you're protected. We talk about safety. Let's talk about personal safety. Safety from the homeowner, okay, or the building occupant, okay. Typically, this is what happens. Most of the time, you are doing your audit on your own, okay? When I was working with Excel, doing Excel audits, one of my trainers was a woman. Okay, subject actually never came up. So some okay, so we know Randy, right? Randy also has a group that he works with, which is a kind of conglomeration of companies, and in that conglomeration of companies, there's a company that's been formulated with two women, right? It's formed, there's two women in this company, and what they have decided to do is to go on audits together, okay? And basically what they do is they split the audit. So they go together, one does one part of the audit, one does another part of the audit, and they've figured out how to effectively cut the time in half so that it's worth it to have two people on one audit. So they've figured out, in essence, how to do 4 audits a day with 2 people, okay? So, it's entirely up to you, but, don't go into a situation that you feel is dangerous. That's the bottom line. Somebody comes to the door and you're looking at them, you're not in such a great part of town and you're nervous, okay? Don't put yourself in harm's way, right? Always carry your cell phone with you, okay? Pay attention to your surroundings. Don't let yourself get cornered, right? Always make sure, especially if you're in a situation where you feel nervous, make sure you always have a clear path to the front door or the back door or the window or whatever, right? Make sure you always have an escape path. You always want to proceed according to the policies and procedures of your particular agency, okay? If you're working for someone, they have taken this into consideration, right? And if you're concerned about this, especially if you're a woman, right, and you should be, make sure you understand what the protocol is, okay? What if I go to a house and I just don't feel comfortable with the homeowner? What do I do? You need to understand, okay? So If you're working for someone and they're like, just get the job done, I don't care, Angela. Then you got to start thinking, is this the kind of company I want to work for? Personally, as I've been doing audits, I've never run into a situation where I've been working with a homeowner that in any way, shape, or form felt any more dangerous than any of the people in this room. So when it comes to personal protective equipment, make sure we have protective clothing. I talked about the Tyvek suit. There's really, in those Tyvek suits, they come in 3 different varieties. You can have, it's just a Tyvek suit, right? No feet, no hood. You can get a Tyvek suit it's a one piece, right? And it's got a hood that comes on it. And then you can get a Tyvek that's got boots in it, okay? And, depending on your preference, that's whatever suit you buy, that's gonna be the suit. Now, if you get these suits, they sell them at insulation wholesalers. And if you buy it at an insulation wholesaler, you pay, $3-4 for it. If you go to someplace else, like a retail center, you're probably gonna pay a lot more, okay? But you really shouldn't pay more than $5 a piece for these things.
Are they a one-time use?
No, they're multi-use. You use them until you tear them up. But you want some kind of protective clothing to be wear. Make sure you have your safety glasses. And hard hat is on this list. And hard hat's an interesting thing because most of the time you won't need it. But when you need it, you will not be able to work without it, okay? So always carry a hard hat, even if you don't need it 98% of the time. Check with your agency the policy, right? If they want you to be dressed a certain way, then you need to be dressed a certain way, and your hard hat needs to match that. If they don't care, if they're like, yeah, you can have stickers all over your hard hat, then no big deal. I would also recommend that you have a hard hat that hasn't been used. And when I say hasn't been used, it hasn't been hit by something, right? Sometimes we're out on the job site, we've got a hard hat that we've been used for years, and something's fallen on that hard hat, a drill or something, and we've actually used it as a hard hat, okay? We fell and we hit our head or something like that. That's a good time to replace a hard hat, okay? But if we've had a hard hat we've had for years, and we haven't had 50-pound items sitting on top of it, and we know that it's still functional, then yeah, absolutely. And the only thing I would also check is make sure it meets the current ANSI standards. Gas leak detector. Now, a gas leak detector is an electronic device that sniffs for hydrocarbons, like fuel oil, gasoline, or natural gas. So even though it's called a gas leak detector, it will detect other things. Now, when you use that electronic device, the gas leak detector, and it beeps because it detects a leak, then we'll use a liquid leak detector. And we put that on the joint where we found the leak, and it'll bubble. If it bubbles, then that tells us that it's a real leak, because things like pipe dope that goes on gas pipe, you know about that? That will actually make our gas leak detector beep, but it's not really a leak. That's why we have to use our liquid leak detector to verify our electronic gas leak detector. Next, we have the carbon monoxide detector. Now, the carbon monoxide detector we get in 2 different forms. We have either a belt style or one that goes in the pocket, and that detects ambient CO and usually will alarm when it reaches 35 parts per million or 25 parts per million, whatever we set it at. Then we have the combustion analyzer. Now, we use the combustion analyzer when we're doing our ICAST testing. We detect the amount, we use it to measure the amount of carbon monoxide that's coming out of the combustion appliance, the water heater or our furnace, boiler, that sort of thing. Moisture meter is optional. Some auditors carry it, some don't. And basically what it does is it measures humidity. An infrared thermal IR camera. Excellent, excellent tool to detect air leaks, detect problems in insulation, okay? In addition, we used ours to detect air leaks. But you can also use these as you can scan the top of a wall, and we do this for quality control in the weatherization business. The crew comes in, blows insulation in the wall, and it needs to be tightly packed so that it doesn't settle. A couple days later, we go through with an IR gun and we look at the top of the wall all the way around, and you can see with the thermal image settling. Or this often happens, they miss that there's a fire block. So they fill the lower cavity, but they missed the upper cavity, okay? We can also see things like thermal bypasses. Remember we talked about on the board yesterday where we had that wall with 2 different height ceilings, okay? So we can actually shoot a wall and see, okay? We also saw where we had some insulation that had fallen down in one bay, right? We can also see those kinds of things with our thermal imaging camera. Also, a digital camera. Digital cameras are critical, absolutely critical, because those are what are going to jog your memory about what happened on that audit. Because you're going to take pictures and pictures and pictures and pictures and pictures and pictures, okay? I was telling you about my auditing friend who was wearing his respirator. He does geo audits, and he takes at least 60 to 90 pictures at every single house, pictures of everything, okay? And this is critical because if you run into some kind of problem and you fall behind on writing your reports, okay? And so now you're finally sitting down to write your report, and you have 3 or 4 reports to write, and you're trying to think, okay, which house was that? Okay, well, let's see, this one was missing some insulation, or was it this one over here? Wait a minute, what? So that's where your pictures come in handy, okay? You can actually go through your pictures, and your pictures walk you back through that audit and allow you to do 2 things. It jogs your memory for your report, but we can also use those pictures with the IR image to motivate the homeowner to do something. If you take a look at this slide, what's going on in this slide? This slide is a little bit of a joke, right? And if you look at that caption, can you make a home too tight? You remember I was telling you about this guy in Boulder, right? I told you about the guy in Boulder, okay? Now, his house was already too tight, okay? That wasn't me. But as a energy efficiency expert, as a home energy auditor, as a building analyst, you can actually come into a home and make that home too tight through your recommendations. And when you tighten up a home too much, you cause problems. What kind of problems can you cause by tightening up a house too much? Okay, we increase the humidity, because remember, we talked about a hole in a building brings humidity in with it. Well, a hole in the building also allows humidity to go out with the air, okay? What else? Air exchange. If we don't have enough air exchange, okay, that's our problem, right? So what kinds of secondary problems are created? Mold, okay? So we have mold, and we have mold because we have moisture and condensation happening on cold surfaces, because, you know, we increased our humidity. With our increased humidity, now we have our condensation. With the condensation, now we have a constant source of moisture on drywall and those sorts of things, which allows mold to grow, right? What else? What other kinds of problems are created by over-tightening a house? Carbon monoxide, okay? If we have combustion appliances that are leaking carbon monoxide into our house, if we tighten it up, we increase those carbon monoxide levels because they can't get out anymore. When it comes to things like distributing heat, those are closed systems, right? So in an ideal situation, we put warm air into the house, and then it goes back through the returns, right? So our circulation is entirely dependent on that closed circuit system, right? But we still need fresh air coming into the house, because if we don't have enough fresh air coming in the house, then the house feels stuffy, we get increased humidity, we get condensation on windows, our carbon monoxide builds up, and any other kind of airborne toxins that might be in the house start to build up as well, okay? Because we don't have enough air moving through our house. And consequently, we end up with this term, sick building syndrome, right? Let's talk about problems associated with high humidity. We have things like wood rot, mold and mildew, and dust mites. Let's talk about identifying hazards. We have mold, we have asbestos, and we have lead. Those are our three major ones. Now understand that we are building analysts, energy efficiency experts, energy efficiency auditors. So unless we have a mold certification, unless we have an asbestos certification, unless we have a lead certification, we're not mold inspectors, asbestos inspectors, lead inspectors. So when we see these things and we identify them as a problem, then we want to make a recommendation to the homeowner that they get a certified mold inspector, certified asbestos inspector, certified lead inspector to actually do the inspection. Okay, so we're going to talk about identifying these things and their hazards, their associated hazards, so that we can educate the homeowner and motivate them to actually get these kinds of inspections. Okay, but unless we have those certifications, we want to be careful about what we say respecting things like mitigation and, you know, identification of these kinds of problems. Microbial contamination, mold, for example. In order to have mold, we have to have both a food source and a moisture source. You have to have food and moisture. When you see mold growing on a wall, a drywall wall, what is the mold eating? It's the paper. It's not the paint because the paint's inorganic. It's not the gypsum because the gypsum's inorganic. It's the paper. It's the drywall paper that the mold is eating. Usually when you have microbial contamination, there's an associated odor. We see this a lot of times, right? When we pull that container of whatever it was out of the refrigerator, and we open it up and we're like, wow, I wish I hadn't done that.
Mystery meat.
The mystery meat, right? Looks like it's about to get up and walk out of the fridge, right? It's nice and furry for us, right? And if it's bad enough, we just put the lid back on and just toss the whole thing in the trash. Never mind trying to wash it, right? Okay, that's microbial contamination. That smell will exist in a house if you have a really bad mold problem, okay? So pay attention to your nose. Unfortunately, I mean, this is changing, but unfortunately, this mold issue is one of the least regulated issues. That's changing, but still, there's not a lot of, not like asbestos. I mean, asbestos is tightly controlled. Mold, not so much. When we mitigate mold, when we try to get rid of mold, there's a number of different procedures depending on what kind of mold it is, but those procedures tend to be very, very similar to each other. And again, recommend a certified mold inspector if we see a problem, okay? Now, I'm going to classify mold problems into three different categories. I'm going to say you have a mild mold problem, a medium mold problem, and a serious mold problem, okay? Now, a small mold problem like this one, shown on this slide, this mold problem could probably be taken care of with a little bit of bleach and some kind of cover-up like a Kills. The homeowner could probably do this. I'm an auditor, right? I'm an energy auditor. I can't really recommend anything to you, right? But in my experience, I've seen other homeowners successfully handle this problem. This one is what we call a little more serious mold problem, okay? This one, I would definitely recommend, strongly recommend to the homeowner that they get a certified mold inspector and they have this mold mitigated by a professional, This one, I would run screaming like a little girl. Yeah, that's a ceiling. That's a real house. This is not digitally enhanced photograph. This is a real house. And unfortunately, there are people still living in this house at the time of the photograph. Okay? No, I didn't take this photo. You can obviously imagine the problems that are going on in this house with health issues. Okay? I had a gentleman who told a story, just a horrible story about mold. Okay? He rents or buys a warehouse where they had been restoring old cars. And this warehouse had been closed up for about 20 years. Nobody had been in there. Okay? When they opened it up, he found mold spores that were a foot off the wall in thickness.
Did he walk inside?
Okay? Now, mind you, this was back in the late 80s. So he hires some folks, and in they go. Start to clean this thing up. Okay? A day and a half, he was bedridden. Okay? Now remember, I said this was late 80s? He's just now getting back on his feet. Okay? And to this day, he can't have anything with yeast in it. Right? I mean, it took him that long going through all kinds of different medical treatments and alternative medicine to get back to where he's there, so that he's just barely functional at this point. Okay? So, you know, we know a lot more about mold than we did. You know, back then, I mean, he said, you know, he went in to clean this stuff up, no respirator, no masks, you know, just some buckets of water and, you know, crowbars to get these things off the wall. I tell these stories and I go through this because, you know, when I talk about my friend with the respirator, right? Black mold underneath, glad I'm wearing the respirator. It's big deals. This is big deals. Sometimes you will run into a situation like this, right? And you gotta be careful. And, you know, your recommendation, you're going to run screaming like a little girl, and you're going to turn around on the way out the door, and you're going to make the recommendation to the homeowner that they do the same thing. Right? Don't grab anything. Just leave, go get a hotel room. Go see a doctor. In order to have mold, you have to have two things. You have to have moisture, and you have to have food, right? So mold will die, just like a plant, if you cut off its moisture source. Right? So, you know, if you run into a situation where that moisture source goes away, you know, but I'd still be very, very careful, because unless you are a certified mold inspector, you know, how do you know if the mold's dead or not? Right. Okay? And if it's, you know, even if it's dead, you still have spores. If you see a mold problem, your report should say, mitigate the mold problem, then do whatever your other recommendations are. The only situation where I would not complete my audit as a result of finding a problem would be if that problem endangered my safety immediately. Okay? For example, carbon monoxide. A respirator will not filter carbon monoxide, okay? This is something you need to understand about a respirator. The respirator that I showed you is called an air purifying respirator. It takes particulate matter out of the air. It does not change air quality. So, as I'm doing my audit, I'm monitoring the levels of carbon monoxide in the house. If the level of carbon monoxide in the house, ambient in the air, exceeds 35 parts per million, okay? BPI says that I need to shut down my test, my audit, evacuate both myself and anybody else in the building, open all the doors and windows, and wait for the carbon monoxide levels to come down, okay? So that's an example of I can't keep going, I need to move on. But if I run into something like mold and a mold problem, right, and I'm looking at the mold problem, I got my respirator on and everything else, then I would do exactly what you said. I'd finish up my audit, and I'd write my audit report, and the audit report would say, you must take care of this mold problem before you do anything else that I'm going to recommend that you do. And that's exactly what my friend did, right? He finishes up his audit, says to the homeowner, look, we can, because he's working for the GEO, right? So they're going to get work done for free, the homeowner. But that's not part of fixing mold problems is not part of their deal, right? Talks to the homeowner, says we'd love to do the work, we can do the work, but you have to take care of this mold problem first. They want the work done. They call them a couple of weeks later and say, mold problem taken care of. They come back out, they inspect, on they go with the work. In this slide, what we see is a floor joist with a little bit of mold growing on it. And this shot is pretty tight. And so the idea behind this particular slide is to show you that sometimes you have to look pretty close to see microbial contamination. But remember, we have to have food, which is our wood on our joists, but we also have to have moisture. So if we go down into our crawl space, and we're moving around in our crawl space, and it is bone dry everywhere we look. Are we gonna, what's our potential for mold? Low, very, very low. So we're not gonna spend a whole lot of time trying to find mold, looking carefully and examining everything. If we get down in the basement and we're like through mud, okay, now we're gonna start paying a lot more attention and looking for this kind of mold issues. Here's a good example looking up at some floor joists in a basement that are suffering from some dry rot. Dry rot, wet rot, right? It's a moisture issue problem, and this wood is rotting. What you're looking for, if you see a little bit of discoloration, okay, you're looking for active, and happens when you're inspecting an attic. You look at the roof deck, you're looking for water, evidence of water damage, okay? Take a careful look at it. If it's wet, if you see just the white stuff, right, it dried. When was the last time she had a roof put on? She probably had, did they replace the roof decking? Yeah. Okay, so there was probably, she probably had a leak, right? A small leak, and that's what was causing this discoloration. Check it in about 6 months. Okay, you shouldn't see any of these dark spots. It should just be, you just see patches of white where there was evidence of water damage. But, how old was the roof? So just check it in 6 months and make sure the problem's gone away. Movement of water vapor. Okay, this is moisture in a building. Sources of moisture in a building. We have bulk sources like rain gutters, pipes, ice dams. These kinds of things can bring large amounts of water into a building if they're not managed properly. We have water vapor that comes from cooking, from plants, taking showers, even respiration, right? We see this sometimes in a cold day, just breathing, we can fog up our glasses, okay? So that moisture is being introduced inside of our building. And when that moisture that's inside of our building then condenses on a cold surface, okay, then that vapor goes back to a liquid. We see that on our mirrors, in our bathrooms, and our windows inside of our house. So we're going to control that moisture using a vapor barrier. When that vapor barrier is installed properly, it's continuous, it's used in conjunction with a good air barrier, then we can manage that moisture and make sure that the moisture that's outside stays outside, or the moisture that's inside gets outside. Carbon monoxide and other toxins. In order to have carbon monoxide, we must have combustion, because carbon monoxide is the result of combustion. If we have an all-electric house, we're not going to have carbon monoxide in the house unless the folks live by a bus stop or they're burning something in the oven. So here's a question. that comes up a lot of times. How do you install CO detectors? Where do they go? Okay, CO is basically neutral. It's not lighter than air, it's not heavier than air, it just kind of pretty much just hangs around. So depending on who you're talking to, some people will say install it down low, other people will say install it up high, okay, like a smoke detector. But smoke, of course, is lighter than air, right? So it'll go up. CO, not like that. It's buoyancy neutral. So install your CO detectors according to two things: code and the instructions on your carbon monoxide detector. Okay? Those are the two things that you need to pay attention to. Okay? As a general rule, again, check your code for your area, but as a general rule, you want at least one carbon monoxide detector outside of the hallway that connects your bedrooms. Okay? So you want at least one there. Next, you want to have one on each floor. And then finally, you want to have one, if you not in the furnace room, just outside of the furnace room. And understand that if your furnace room is installed properly, anybody have in your furnace room, you've got these two big pipes that come in, right? Anybody stuff those with rags or something?
No.
Talking about the fresh air ducts?
Yeah. Anybody got those stuffed with? Okay, good. Good for you. Those are those are for makeup air. Okay? And what that is when your combustion appliances are running, they're pulling air out of your room to burn. What those air ducts allow is it allows that furnace to pull air from outside and burn that air from outside, as opposed to taking the oxygen from you that you need to continue your existence. Okay? So, again, here's another health and safety issue. You get to a house, just about every homeowner is going to say, you know, what are those things for? Some of them you're going to find stopped up. They're like, oh, you know, I just plug these up because it's like a giant hole in my house. Yes, it is a giant hole in your house, and it's on purpose, and don't plug these things up. Let's finish talking about our health and safety issues. When we're talking about CO, sources of CO and other toxins, we have combustion appliances like our furnaces that we talked about. Also in our garage, we have things like automobiles. Automobiles, internal combustion engine, generate carbon monoxide, okay? The generators, let's say we're a welder or something like that, and we've got our generator going in our garage. Again, sources of carbon monoxide, and those carbon monoxide fumes can make their way into our structure if our garage door or our wall assembly between our house and our garage don't do a good job of keeping those things out. And again, if we over tighten our house and we don't let those things out, it creates a problem. We also have chemical storage, furniture, carpet, cleaning supplies, those sorts of things. All of those things are in our house, right? Furnishings and carpet, we get new carpet, we call it that new car smell, right? That new car smell isn't all that healthy for us. It's not. They're called VOCs. Okay? Not good for you. Paint. Not really a great idea to store paint inside. Is everything that we're storing in our house, is it in a sealed container, right? Is that container leaking? Okay? These are all things that we want to keep in mind, right? Okay, so all that stuff is happening inside of our homeowner's house. And if we over tighten our house, we over tighten their house, it's going to create and make these kinds of problems worse, because these toxic gases and fumes and everything else don't have a way outside. Always pay attention to smells, right? You think you smell gas, right? Carbon monoxide, of course, is odorless and colorless, right? Natural gas is also odorless and colorless, but they add an odor to it.
Yes.
right? So always pay attention to those sorts of things. Let's move on to asbestos. Where do we find asbestos in a home? We can find asbestos in the siding. We can find asbestos in floor tiles. We can find asbestos in insulation. And we can find asbestos in the popcorn texture. Asbestos is a mineral, and that mineral is fire, not retardant, but fire resistance. Asbestos will not burn, period. Okay? It's also a very good insulator. Now, the problem with asbestos, which we didn't understand when we first started mining it, is that asbestos also cannot be absorbed by the body. Okay? Your body cannot break down asbestos fibers. Okay? They are microscopic and excellingly sharp. So what happens is when you breathe those in, they are part of you. Your body can't break it down, and as a result, your body just tries to encapsulate these fibers. But, like I mentioned, these fibers are very sharp. So, as you go about your daily life, those fibers will cut their way through what your body encapsulated them in. And ultimately, what you'll end up with is microscopic holes in your lungs, okay? Basically rendering your lungs inoperable. You'll also end up with cancers associated with this encapsulating process that your body is doing. Consequently, it's very, very important for everyone that may be exposed to asbestos at some point to wear a respirator that will filter these microscopic fibers out of the air before they get into your lungs. Asbestos only becomes dangerous when it is fried, which means that it's made airborne. So, for example, if you're up in an attic and you see, and I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute, you see a picture of vermiculite, or I'm sorry, you see a picture. You're up in the attic and you see vermiculite. Okay, that's particularly dangerous because as you move around in the attic, you can step on the vermiculite, crushing it, frying it, making it airborne. Okay? But if, we also talked about popcorn texture, right? There's no need to alarm your homeowner that, oh, you know, popcorn ceiling has asbestos in it. You know, you better be careful. You better evacuate your house. No, it's not a problem until they start to do a remodel. And they start scraping this popcorn ceiling off. You know, because popcorn ceiling, right? That's the height of fashion, right? Okay. I don't know. Even when it was popular, it was ugly.
Yes, you're right.
Right? Okay. So really, we only need to worry about asbestos when it is fried and is friable. This slide shows vermiculite. Vermiculite really kind of looks like, you know, when you burn your log in your fireplace and those little kind of geometric chunks fall off. That's what it looks like. Looks like those little geometric chunks. Vermiculite is actually a type of insulation that sometimes has asbestos in it. Not all vermiculite has asbestos in it, but most vermiculite does. This slide shows an example of asbestos insulation around pipework. Now, when you're looking at asbestos around pipework, asbestos insulation around pipework, understand, remember, asbestos is a mineral. So asbestos around pipe oftentimes will look like old fiberglass, and they're easy to confuse. But the difference is vermiculite insulation is hard, whereas fiberglass insulation will give. Sometimes you'll run into asbestos tape. Okay, this is another reason why when we talked about putting Pookie or duct mastic on things, you go over the top of whatever's there. Okay, because what you're doing is encapsulating what's there. Okay, and sometimes, this is again why we want a certified asbestos inspector to look at stuff that we're suspicious of. We simply say, I'm not sure what this is. It might be asbestos. I have you suggest that you check it out. We can also find asbestos in floor tile. Now remember, again, asbestos is not dangerous unless we fry it. So if we have floor tiles, we have mastic. We can also find asbestos in mastic that we put floor tile down with. You know, if it's just there and the homeowner's not planning on doing any kind of remodeling, we're fine, okay? This is an example of asbestos insulation gone bad. And what's likely happened here is it's gotten wet and it's starting to come apart. And remember, asbestos is brittle. So it's gotten wet, it's kind of come apart, but this is probably dried out. So if we grab a hold of it, we bump into it, whatever, we're going to end up frying it. So if we see something like that, we want to be very, very careful. Okay? This might be another reason to go running, screaming like a little girl. Okay? We can also find asbestos in siding. And again, as long as the siding is in place, it's not crumbling or something like that, we're okay. One other place you might find asbestos is actually in drywall mud, believe it or not. We're talking about safety, right? So make sure that you educate your homeowner. Make sure that if they're having work done on their house, that they understand. Make sure that you encourage them to educate themselves on the appropriate procedures, how their house should be worked on. Make sure they spend the money and take the time to get their house tested the way it's supposed to be, okay, and to protect themselves, and make sure that you yourself are protected if you're either doing the audit or working for a weatherization agency that's doing work like that. The last subject we're going to talk about is lead, okay? Now, lead naturally occurs outside, but most of the lead problems happen inside a building because of lead paint, and the folks who are most affected are children. This is what I've been told about lead and lead paint, okay? You're thinking to yourself, why on earth would you eat paint to begin with? Well, according to what I've been told and what I understand, children will eat paint, lead paint in particular, because it tastes sweet. Sort of like antifreeze, right? It looks like Kool-Aid. Lead paint in good condition is not a problem. It's only when lead paint starts to look like what we see on this slide. It starts to peel, it starts to chip. That's when it begins to be a problem. It's also a problem if you're drilling or sanding, because then it becomes a dust and becomes airborne. How do we test for lead? There's really three primary ways we test for lead. One is we take a chip of paint and we send it to the lab. Okay, and they do a test on it and they come back with us with a report and say, this is lead, this isn't lead, this is this and that and the other thing. Okay. The next, you see this gun. This is the X-Met. It's got a radioactive isotope on it. You take the gun, you put it up against the wall, you pull the trigger, and it tells you whether there's lead in the paint. Okay? These things are awesome, very, very convenient, not that expensive. They're only run about $20,000. And if you want to have somebody come out to your job site and do this test, they'll probably charge you about $200 a trigger pull. The third method is what you see over on the left-hand side of the slide, the home lead test kit. Okay, this is fairly simple. You take a utility knife, you score the paint all the way through. Okay, then you take one of these lead test kits. It's got a little Q-tip at the end, and you break it open, shake it up, run the Q-tip across the cut. And then you look at it. If it turns red, then it's lead. Yeah, I thought that was cute too. Okay? Now, here's the problem. This kit does not work on drywall because the gypsum in the drywall will turn that tip red. Okay? Now, there's actually one more version of this kit. There's the professional version of this kit. Works the same way. You take it out, you break it open, you shake it up, you run it across your cut. The difference is, on the Pro Kit, if you run it across the cut and it stays white, there's a card in the kit that has lead on it. Then you run it across the card and it should turn red. If you run it across the card and it's still white, that means it's bad. You throw it away, grab another one. You're not testing for lead unless you're going to do some work to it, right? And even if you're painting, it's like you're going to sand, you're going to drill holes, you're going to do demolition, you're going to disturb the paint. That's when you test, right? If you're going to disturb the paint, then you're going to disturb the paint, and putting a mark on the paint doesn't matter. Why do we care as energy efficiency experts, as energy auditors, as building analysts? Why do we care about lead paint? Because some of our recommendations are going to call for the disturbing of the paint. For example, if we recommend that they pump insulation into a wall cavity, guess what? They're going to have to cut a hole in that wall cavity, creating paint dust. Yes? Yes. Okay? So that's why lead is an important concern. Also, if we go into a house and it's pre-1972, for example, and we see paint chipping on the wall, and they have children, that's something we're going to want to educate the homeowner on. Especially, and this happens on windowsills a lot, right? When we see this chipping paint, we want to tell the homeowner, you want to make sure that you get this tested. Okay? If this paint is lead-based paint, then you want to make sure that you take care of this. You got children running around. This is going to be a problem, right? Now, abatement of lead. We're going to talk about this. So when we abate lead, we have to contain it as we're eliminating it. And again, depending on the regulations in the area that you're working, determine on what you have to do. Okay? But all these abatement techniques involve the removing of the paint and any related paint dust. Okay? We need to make sure that we contain the contamination, encapsulate it, and then replace any surfaces or fixtures. Okay? So we remove the paint, we contain the dust, then we have to repaint either over whatever's left, right? We have to resurface it. One of those things. We either got to get rid of it or we got to encapsulate it. Let's review. High humidity in a home can cause 1, wood rot or structural damage. 2, mold and mildew. 3, dust mites. True or false? You can often smell carbon monoxide in a home while performing an energy audit. That is false. Carbon monoxide is odorless and colorless and will kill you. You must have a carbon monoxide meter in order to detect it. Making a house tighter can cause health and safety problems because of the lack of adequate ventilation. Moisture can be reduced by installing over bare soil in crawl spaces, moisture barrier. In an exterior wall, the highest relative humidity levels are found where? On the warmest surface or on the coldest surface? on the coldest surface, because as temperature goes down, relative humidity goes up. Water vapor moves from high vapor pressure to low vapor pressure. When it comes to health and safety, we need to remember that when we're in a client home, we want to do no harm. We need to keep ourselves informed about hazards, make good decisions, and keep safety foremost in our minds.